When I bought my home, I thought I was buying peace. You know that dream. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, maybe kids riding bikes in the cul-de-sac while parents wave from their porches. I pictured barbecues in the summer, crisp leaves in the fall, and a community that felt safe and welcoming. What I didn't know was that my neighborhood wasn't run by the people who lived there. It was ruled by one man with a smug grin, a clipboard, and an ego the size of Texas. His name was Todd. Now let me paint a picture of Todd, because this man was unforgettable. Early 50s, always in pressed polo shirts that looked like they came straight from some HOA uniform catalog. He had this way of standing, feet planted too wide, chest puffed out like a drill sergeant, and his favorite accessory, that damned clipboard where he supposedly kept notes on violations but, in reality, used it like a weapon. You could almost hear the Jaws theme when he came marching down the street, scanning people's lawns like he was searching for criminals. The first time I met him, I was pulling into my driveway with boxes still in the back seat of my car. I hadn't even unpacked. Todd strolled up, clipboard in hand, and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. Just so you know, garbage cans need to be pulled back in no later than 9 a.m. the morning after pickup. We don't want to start off on the wrong foot. No hi, how are you? No neighborly smile. Just a rule, a warning, and that smirk." First, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just thorough. Every community has a stickler, right? But Todd wasn't just thorough. He was obsessed. And worse, he had power. As president of the Homeowners Association, he held the ability to fine, threaten, and intimidate anyone who didn't live up to his impossible standards. And oh, did he use it? It didn't take long for me to see what life under Todd Sitcher really meant. My next-door neighbor, a sweet retired teacher named Mrs. Wilson, once forgot to mow her lawn for a week because she was recovering from surgery. Todd fined her $100. Not a warning, not an offer to help. Just a fine slipped into her mailbox with the words "neglect of property" written across it in red ink. Another neighbor, the Johnsons, had their teenage son park his car in the street overnight when their driveway was full. The next morning, a $150 fine for unauthorized street parking. But here's the kicker. Todd didn't follow the rules himself. His own yard looked like a construction site. He had an oversized shed that didn't meet zoning codes, a fence taller than regulations allowed, and piles of wood stacked against his house. If anyone else tried that, they'd be drowning in fines. But Todd, he was untouchable, and he reveled in it. I'll never forget one summer morning, standing outside talking to a neighbor while Todd strutted past. He glanced at my fence, a simple wooden one, solid but nothing fancy, and frowned. Then he said, loud enough for both of us to hear, "That stain looks off color. You might want to fix that before it becomes an issue." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. But 2 weeks later, I received a letter. $500 fine for unapproved fence color. I was furious. I had receipts showing the approved stain color was out of stock at every store in town, and I had chosen the closest match I could find. It wasn't neon pink. It wasn't rainbow striped. It was brown. A shade of brown so close to the approved one you'd need a paint swatch to tell the difference. So I called Todd. I explained politely, even sent him the receipts. His response? He smirked, literally smirked, and he said, "Rules are rules. If we let one person slide, everyone will want exceptions." Then he hung up. That was the moment I realized what we were really dealing with. This wasn't about community standards or keeping property values high. This was about power, control, and Todd loved every second of it. But here's the thing about me. I don't like bullies, especially the kind who hide behind rules they don't even follow themselves. And while Todd thought he had me cornered, what he didn't know was that I had already decided something in that moment. I wasn't just going to fight him. I was going to destroy him, not by yelling, not by breaking the rules, not by stooping to his level. No, I would play the long game. I would smile, nod, and bide my time. And when the moment came, I would pull the rug out from under him so hard that he'd never recover. But before I could bring him down, I had to understand how he worked. and that meant stepping into his world, right under his nose. That was the start of my revenge. The $500 fine sat on my kitchen counter like an accusation. I looked at that crumpled envelope again and felt a rush of heat behind my eyes. The kind that starts in your throat and moves into your fists. I'm not proud of that feeling. I just remember it clearly. The hot, metallic taste of injustice, the small, humiliating drumbeat of "you don't matter" in my ears. I tried reason first, like a sane person would. I called Todd, left polite voicemails, sent emails with receipts attached, waited. The silence was deliberate, like a trap snapping shut. When he finally answered, his tone was butter over steel. "We have to be fair," he said. "We have to be consistent." Then he smirked again, like he'd just proven a point. That smirk was the last straw. I'd been patient up to that moment. I paid fees. I'd kept my yard in the neat suburban way you're supposed to. But that smirk told me everything. Todd wasn't interested in fairness. He was interested in control. So I made a decision most people never make, because most people are exhausted by the slow drip of petty tyranny. I would become what he underestimated, the insider. I signed up at the next HOA meeting under the banner of community involvement, and I said it in a voice that was warm and sincere. The board had 3 open seats. No one else raised their hand. Todd's eyes flicked to me with something like amusement. He'd already decided I was harmless. He'd decided, as bullies always do, that I didn't pose a threat. That gave me an advantage. For the first few months, I acted like the exact kind of person you'd want on an HOA board. Polite, detail-oriented, eager to learn. I took notes in a spiral notebook and learned the rhythm of their meetings. How they started late, how Todd liked to dominate the agenda, how votes were arranged when friendly faces were present. I smiled when others complained. I laughed at Todd's jokes when they landed. I nodded when he lectured about bylaws. But privately, I was building a file. For the first few months, I acted like the exact kind of person you'd want on an HOA board. Polite, detail-oriented, eager to learn. I took notes in a spiral notebook and learned the rhythm of their meetings. How they started late, how Todd liked to dominate the agenda, how votes were arranged when friendly faces were present. I smiled when others complained. I laughed at Todd's jokes when they landed. I nodded when he lectured about bylaws. But privately, I was building a file. I started compiling copies of checks, cross-referencing invoice numbers, talking to vendors listed on payments until I found the ones who'd never done the work. I found canceled checks made out to companies that, on paper, didn't have real operations. I got notarized statements from neighbors who remembered seeing contractors perform work on Todd's property that never matched the invoices. Every piece was one more nail in a coffin I hadn't yet opened. The more I found, the more I realized why Todd had been so ruthless with small fines. Intimidation covered the gaps. If people were busy paying $200 for a trash can violation, they were less likely to question the missing money. Fear quieted the neighborhood. That realization hardened something inside me. This wasn't personal vindication anymore. This was about justice. It was about returning the money and the dignity to the people who had been cheated. I remember lying awake that night, the notebook beside me, my mind running through possible consequences. What if he found out I was gathering evidence? What if he tried to ruin me? But the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse than any risk. So I doubled down. I kept my seat at the table. I kept smiling when Todd swaggered in. I kept my notebook, my spreadsheets, and my patience. Because bullies like Todd always make one predictable mistake. They underestimate the quiet ones. And that mistake is all I needed. Once the numbers blinked back at me, $50,000 clean and cold, the work changed. It was no longer about proving to myself that Todd was crooked. It was about turning that private knowledge into public truth, without giving him a single chance to bury it. I started with slow, quiet moves. Big exposes are won on small, careful steps. First, I organized every scrap into something readable. Spreadsheets are merciless when used right. Rows and columns that don't lie. I color-coded transactions, highlighted transfers to personal accounts, and placed invoices next to photos of the exact locations those invoices supposedly covered. Every landscaping fee had a corresponding photo of a dead lawn. Every pool repair had a note from a neighbor who remembered the pool being closed while Todd's kids swam there. I made timelines. I made chains. I made the pattern undeniable. Then I made it portable. I printed copies, bound them with black plastic spirals, and put a simple cover sheet on each. HOA Financial Audit, 2018 to 2024. The title sounded official, and that was intentional. People trust the look of paperwork. They trust a report more than a rant. But paperwork meant nothing if nobody read it. So I became a door knocker. I hate door knocking. I always have. But on those late summer evenings, flipping through pages on stoops and porches, something else happened. I saw faces that reminded me why this mattered. The family with 2 toddlers who dreamed of the pool opening. The elderly couple who'd saved for years to move into a quiet neighborhood. The single mom who worked 2 jobs and still paid her HOA dues on time. They were not numbers. They were people, and they had been robbed. I kept the pitch simple and human. I didn't throw spreadsheets at them the first time. I opened with empathy. Did you ever get the feeling something's off with our HOA? Asked. Do you remember when the pool was closed for months? Did you ever think that seemed strange? I watched the wheels turn behind their eyes. The small talk cracked. Curiosity slid into worry. Worry slid into anger. When they asked for proof, I handed it over. I didn't dramatize. I let the documents speak. Men and women scanned pages with faces that changed. Some were silent. Some laughed. A short, incredulous bark that meant disbelief and a dawning fury. One neighbor, Miguel, slammed his palm on a table and said, "We need to do something." His voice was small but jagged. Felt like a match striking in a dry place. Not everyone wanted to get involved. That was expected. People have lives. People fear retaliation. I didn't pressure them. I told them what I intended to do. Call for an audit, demand an independent review, and if necessary, vote Todd out. I asked them to come to the annual meeting. I asked them to bring only one thing: themselves. The fear tactics Todd used were effective. He'd scold people in front of others. He'd make examples. But he hadn't counted on something quieter. People who were quietly tired of being gaslit. Once one neighbor voiced suspicion, others followed. It's contagious, that righteous anger. It spreads faster than any rumor. While I rallied the neighborhood, I also shored up legal and professional support. I reached out to a local CPA. Not to press charges, not yet, but to see if my findings had the shape of real embezzlement. The CPA looked through my binder, squinted at the highlighted transfers, and said, "This isn't bookkeeping error. This is deliberate misclassification and diversion." He agreed to provide a letter of opinion that would carry weight at a meeting, and with the auditor we would eventually hire. I also contacted an independent auditor I'd found by asking around and watching who did honest work in our county. The auditor was professional, curt, and slightly amused by my amateur detective work. "You've done the heavy lifting," she told me. "I'll do the verification." Her willingness to step in made the whole plan feel real. It turned gossip into a legal possibility. Every move I made was calculated to reduce Todd's options. If he couldn't hide the records, he couldn't stall forever. If he couldn't intimidate everyone, he couldn't control the vote. If he couldn't convince a professional auditor that the books were clean, then he'd be exposed in front of the whole community. As the annual meeting approached, I felt the tension like static in the air. It hummed in the hollow parts of my house at night. Small things became loud. The creak of my front gate, the neighbor's dog barking at midnight. I kept rehearsing what I would say, the exact phrasing that would be calm but sharp. I practiced opening sentences until they sounded like a natural breath. I also had to manage a new danger: paranoia. Todd's behavior had taught me he could be vindictive. He might try to dig into my life, smear me, or use HO rules to punish me. So I took steps to protect myself. I copied all communications to multiple people. I kept a record of every interaction. I asked a friend to sit in on meetings with me as a witness. I made sure my legal contacts were ready. Preparation is armor. It feels boring to say that. And yet, when the night came, that armor would matter. 2 nights before the meeting, I walked the neighborhood and left an anonymous flyer under many doors. A free independent audit. Come to the annual meeting. No more, no less. It was a nudge, a prod. People wondered who left it. Some thought it was Todd trying to stir things up in his favor. Others thought it was a prank. That mystery helped get them curious, which was enough. The day before the meeting, Todd sent out his usual newsletter. Reminders about fines, a thinly veiled brag about the tight financial oversight he provided, and a list of upcoming social events. He signed it in the same neat font he used for everything, as if type could stand in for character. I read it and felt a strange mixture of pity and contempt. He had been so careful to craft his image that he believed it wholly. On the evening of the meeting, the school gym smelled like gym mats and stale coffee. Chairs lined in rows. The usual handful of homeowners occupied the front. The rest of the room was half empty, as always. My heart thudded in my throat in a way that felt both foreign and intimate, like a heavy drumbeat that meant something true was about to happen. Then people started to arrive. One by one, neighbors I had spoken to during those porch visits filed in. The Johnsons, Mrs. Wilson, Miguel and his wife, a couple with 2 small children who looked exhausted but determined. They filled the back, then the middle, and finally the front rows. The hum of conversation built until it felt like a low tide. Todd entered like a man on a stage, clipboard in hand, expecting his regular, obedient audience. He scanned the room with practiced disdain, looking for allies. Somewhere in his face I saw surprise, small and sour, when he realized the crowd was larger than usual. He did not, however, show fear. Not then. I sat with my binder at my feet. The spiraled stack felt heavy, like a sleeping thing ready to wake. This was it. The careful, patient work of months had narrowed to a single, decisive night. I would present the evidence. I would ask for an independent audit. I would demand accountability. And if the vote went our way, I would call for Todd to step down. Breathe. Understood. The room hushed. What happened next would change everything. The lights of the school gym felt brighter than usual that night. Almost clinical. A projector hummed in the corner, and a single microphone waited at the center of the stage like a gauntlet. Paper rustled as people shifted in their seats. The room was thick with the kind of silence that never comes from nothing. It's the silence that happens when a crowd is holding its breath. Todd started the meeting with his practice spiel. A few community updates, the usual reminders about trash cans and holiday decorations, and a self-congratulatory recap of how well the budget had been managed. He spoke like a man who had been rehearsed by his own ego. People nodded, some politely, others like it was a reflex. I watched the rhythm of his control, the way his voice could flatten dissent into tired smiles. When he finished, the floor opened for new business. I had my binder in my hands like an anchor. My palms were damp, but my voice, when I started, was steady. That steadiness surprised me. Anger had sharpened into purpose. Before we move on, I said. And for a second, everyone looked confused because we were always supposed to politely follow Todd's agenda. I'd like to discuss the HOA finances. Is tonight really the place for a deep audit? He asked. He looked across the room to find allies. Few masked smiles. But the crowd was different tonight. Farther back, Mrs. Wilson's hands were clasped. Miguel's jaw was set. The projector clicked on behind me, bathing the wall in pale light. I handed out copies of the HOA financial audit, the black-spined report I'd bound months ago. I watched as pages turned, as fingers paused over highlighted lines. The room's temperature seemed to tilt. Paper and ink began to do what whispers couldn't. "Mr. President," I said, voice calm, "could you explain why payments totaling over $50,000 were transferred from HOA accounts into personal accounts under administrative fees and to vendors that, when I searched them, have no physical operations in this county?" For a beat, Todd blinked. That blink was small, but it felt like an animal feeling a trap snap. He cleared his throat. "Those are bookkeeping items," he said. "I handle finances, I keep things running. This is unnecessary theatrics." Hand shot up in the back. "Why does the landscaper's invoice match work we never got?" someone asked. A murmur spread. I clicked the projector. A spreadsheet bloomed on the wall. There were lines and numbers, and underneath, a single damning column. Payments that led to accounts registered under Todd's relatives or companies with P.O. boxes. The room changed. Conversations that had been polite became sharp whispers. Eyes that had accepted Todd's authority flicked to him with hungry curiosity. He attempted to speak, but every time he opened his mouth, someone else read another line from the binder, and the evidence pushed forward like tidewater. He tried to reground the meeting with procedural talk. "This isn't how we handle complaints," he said. "We need to form a committee. We need process." He reached for his clipboard as if it were a shield. I had expected that, and I had already called for an independent auditor to be present. The auditor stood, professional and unflappable, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of numbers and rules. "We were retained to verify these transactions," she said, "based on a preliminary review. There are irregularities that merit a full forensic audit. We recommend immediate suspension of any financial authority held by Mr. Todd pending investigation." There was a sound in the room like a balloon popping, a sharp, high burst of disbelief. Todd's face went from bemused to pale to furious in about 3 breaths. He sputtered, trying to assert dominance. "This is slander," he shouted. "You're accusing me without proof. But proof doesn't need to be screamed. It just needs to be seen." I had more than accusations. I had copies of bank statements, invoices, notarized neighbor statements, contractor correspondence showing work billed to the HOA that clearly occurred at Todd's property. I had a letter from the CPA saying these were not clerical mistakes. The room saw it. The room understood. Voices rose. Not all coherent, not all calm. One man demanded Todd step down. A woman wanted the police called immediately. Mrs. Wilson, her voice thinner than a ribbon, said, "You fined me $100 when I couldn't mow because I was sick. Where is my money now?" The room turned on that question like a pack. Todd's attempts to regain composure devolved into blame. Accusations that this was a personal vendetta, that I wanted power, that I doctored documents. His words were frantic and small. He began to pace, the clipboard rattling like a man echoing his own heartbeat. Then something happened that stripped the remaining control he thought he had. People began to stand. Miguel stood, then the Johnsons, then 2 young parents with sunburned cheeks from watching kids in a park during a summer Todd claimed needed maintenance. Each person who stood made the room a little more honest. Each testimony was a beam prying at the rotten floorboards of Todd's narrative. The board convened a vote. Normally, this would be a predictably procedural moment. A quiet tally, a few perfunctory signatures, back to normal. But tonight was not a normal night. We had witnesses, we had a CPA, and we had an auditor recommending suspension pending a forensic review. I expected resistance. I expected cronyism. What I didn't expect, and what felt like a kind of small, shining miracle, was how quickly neighbors found their courage. People who had paid fines in silence, who had nodded at Todd's authority out of habit, now raised their hands and said, "Enough!" When the count was called, the gym held its breath. The number of votes in favor of suspension and removal was overwhelming. Todd's face crumpled into something that was no longer performance. He flailed, tried to argue technicalities, but the community had spoken. He was stripped of his title that night. Not by a mob, but by a collection of people who had decided their quiet had been exhausted. He left with his papers clutched in his hands and a face like someone who'd been unmasked publicly on television. The humiliation was potent and immediate. People whispered as he walked out. Some laughed. Others simply watched, as if to see whether the man who'd terrorized them for so long would simply vanish into the night. Outside, Todd's truck idled at the curb. I saw him run his hands through his hair. The posture of a man who'd been certain of his power until proof removed it like a stage curtain. I felt something inside me deflate and swell at the same time. Relief, yes, but also a hollow I hadn't expected. Victory had a bitter edge when you realized the work of months came at the cost of watching someone you'd once nodded to remove themselves from grace. That same night, the board voted to call in law enforcement and initiate a formal forensic audit. Todd, stripped of his authority, was left to answer questions that could no longer be smoothed over with a clipboard and a smile. As I walked home under a sky peppered with stars, the neighborhood felt different. Not yet fixed, but waking up. There were sirens later, a flurry of texts, and the low hum of neighbors talking into the small hours about change. I folded my binder and put it on the kitchen table like a closed weapon. I slept for the first time in months without the ache of unsaid things in my chest. But I also knew this was not the end. Removing Todd from power was one thing. Making sure he could never hurt the community again, financially, legally, or emotionally, would take more. There would be police reports, audits, and perhaps courts. There would be fallout. There might be lies, and there might be a fight. For now, though, the immediate battle had been won. The tyrant's clipboard lay empty. The room that had been his stage reclaimed its people. And that, for a neighborhood that had so often been ignored, fined, and dismissed, felt like justice. The morning after the annual meeting, the neighborhood hummed with something I hadn't felt in years. Conversation. Not whispers, not grumbles over fences, but open talk. People lingered on sidewalks, waved a little longer, leaned over hedges to swap disbelief and relief. Todd had been untouchable for so long that his removal felt like pulling a storm drain cover and watching water finally rush free. But for me, it wasn't finished. Exposing him was one thing. Making sure he never clawed his way back was another. The independent auditor got to work immediately. Over the following weeks, binders thicker than mine appeared. Professional, precise, stamped with authority. Their findings made my amateur spreadsheets look like napkin notes. Every transaction was traced, every vendor cross-checked. The final number landed like a hammer. $52,374 in misappropriated funds. Not speculation, not suspicion, proven theft. It wasn't just the money. The auditor uncovered patterns of intimidation buried in board minutes. Fines levied without precedent, selective enforcement of bylaws, records of complaints that Todd had filed against families who spoke up. He hadn't just stolen cash. He had weaponized the HOA itself to keep people compliant. The report was turned over to law enforcement. The county prosecutor reviewed it with what I can only describe as grim satisfaction. "We've seen this before," he told me, tapping the cover page. "But usually people don't fight back. You gave us a roadmap." Todd was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of funds. Court dates were set. His carefully built facade, the man with the clipboard, the self-styled protector of property values, collapsed into booking photos and case files. The trial wasn't cinematic. No grand speeches, no slamming gavels. Just paperwork, testimony, and Todd squirming in a suit that suddenly looked too big for him. Neighbors testified. The auditor testified. Even the CPA I'd consulted gave a statement. I sat in the back not because I had to, but because I needed to see the end with my own eyes. Todd pled guilty. Maybe his lawyer convinced him the evidence was airtight. Maybe he thought a deal was safer than gambling on a jury. Either way, he stood in front of the judge and admitted what he'd done. $50,000 gone, siphoned into his own pockets. His sentence: probation, restitution, community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board. Not prison, not the iron bar justice some neighbors wanted, but enough to strip him of power and reputation. And in some ways, that was the deeper punishment. Todd was a man who thrived on control, on being the loudest voice in the room. Now he couldn't chair a bake sale without someone whispering about his theft. His name, once wielded like a weapon, had become a cautionary tale. The HOA itself had to rebuild. That was almost harder than taking Todd down. Years of fear had left people wary of leadership. Volunteers hesitated to serve on the board. Meetings were awkward, full of questions about transparency. But slowly, cautiously, trust began to grow. A new treasurer was appointed. Miguel, the neighbor who'd slammed his hand on the table when he first saw the evidence. He was steady, fair, and relentless about making sure every dollar was accounted for. Monthly reports became public. Budgets were discussed openly. The pool reopened, not instantly, but with a real plan. The lawns were tended by actual landscapers, not fictional invoices. For the first time in years, the HOA felt like it belonged to the homeowners, not a single petty tyrant. As for me, the aftermath was complicated. On one hand, I felt pride, not just in what I'd uncovered, but in the courage of my neighbors to stand up once they saw the truth. On the other, I carried scars. Months of digging through records, of paranoia, of preparing for retaliation had left me restless. I'd wake at night thinking about missing receipts or second-guessing whether Todd might try some desperate retaliation. But over time, that quiet fear loosened its grip. The neighborhood no longer felt like enemy territory, felt like home again. I was stopped often by neighbors. In driveways, at the mailbox, walking my dog. They thanked me. They offered baked goods, coffee, gratitude that sometimes felt overwhelming. But I always told them the same thing. I didn't do it alone. You showed up. You voted. You made the choice. Because the truth was, I had only been the match. The fire came from them. Months later, I drove past Todd's house. The once pristine lawn was patchy, unkempt. His blinds were drawn. The truck he used to polish every Saturday sat dusty in the driveway. I didn't feel glee. I didn't even feel pity. I felt distance, as if he belonged to a different story altogether. One that had ended, while ours was still being written. Vijoy moved on. We started hosting small block parties again, the kind Todd used to cancel over budget concerns. Kids splashed in the pool that had once been chained shut. Neighbors waved more freely. The air felt lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the cul-de-sacs and sidewalks. Sometimes late at night I think about how close it all came to staying hidden. If no one had questioned, if no one had asked, Todd might still be sitting with his clipboard, cashing checks into his own accounts. That thought chills me, not because of what he did, but because of how easy it is to let things slide when fear is louder than courage. But then I remember the gym that night. The silence breaking, the hands raised, the power shifting back where it belonged. That image is what stays with me. That's the story I hold on to. In the end, justice wasn't a single moment. It was a series of choices. To look closer, to speak up, to stand together. Todd had stolen money, yes. But what he tried to steal most of all was dignity. The simple right of people to live without fear of petty tyranny. We took that back. And for me, that will always matter more than the numbers in a spreadsheet. So when I walk past the pool now, hearing kids laugh where silence once reigned, I think, this is the sound of victory. Not mine alone, but ours. And Todd. He's just a name we mention when reminding each other why we watch, why we question, why we never again let power go unchecked. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't just exposing the thief. It's rebuilding stronger than they ever imagined you could.